Where longs to fall yon rift spire, as weary of the insulting air, the poet's thoughts, the warrior's fire, the lover's sighs, are sleeping there. Langhorne. At the first Scotch town which we reached, my guide sought out his friend and counsellor, to consult upon the proper and legal means of converting into his own lawful property the bonny creature, which was at present his own only by one of those sleight-of-hand arrangements which still sometimes took place in that once lawless district. I was somewhat diverted with the dejection of his looks on his return. He had, it seems, been rather too communicative to his confidential friend, the attorney, and learned with great dismay, in return for his unsuspecting frankness, that Mr. Touthope had, during his absence, been appointed clerk to the peace of the county, and was bound to communicate to justice all such achievements as that of his friend Mr. Andrew Fairservice. There was a necessity, this alert member of the police stated, for arresting the horse, and placing him in Bailie Trumbull's stable, therein to remain at livery, at the rate of 12 shillings, Scotch, per diem, until the question of property was duly tried and debated. He even talked as if, in strict and rigorous execution of his duty, he ought to detain honest Andrew himself, but on my guide's most piteously entreating his forbearance, he not only desisted from this proposal, but made a present to Andrew of a broken-winded and spavined pony, in order to enable him to pursue his journey. It is true, he qualified this act of generosity by exacting from poor Andrew an absolute cession of his right and interest in the gallant palfrey of Thorncliffe Osbaldistone, a transference which Mr. Touthope represented as of very little consequence, since his unfortunate friend, as he facetiously observed, was likely to get nothing of the mare excepting the halter. Andrew seemed woeful and disconcerted, as I screwed out of him these particulars, for his northern pride was cruelly pinched by being compelled to admit that attorneys were attorneys on both sides of the Tweed, and that Mr. Clerk Touthope was not a farthing more sterling coined than Mr. Clerk Jobson. It wadna hae vexed him half a sae muckle to hae been cheated out o' what might amaist be said to be one with the peril o' his Craig, had it happened amang the Englishers, but it was an unco thing to see hawks pike out hawks e'en, or ae kindly Scot cheat on either. But nae doubt things were strangely changed in his country sin the sad and sorrowful union, an event to which Andrew referred every symptom of depravity or degeneracy which he remarked among his countrymen, more especially the inflammation of reckonings, the diminished size of pine stoops, and other grievances, which he pointed out to me during our journey. For my own part, I held myself, as things had turned out, acquitted of all charge of the mare, and wrote to my uncle the circumstances under which she was carried into Scotland, concluding with informing him that she was in the hands of justice, and her worthy representatives, Bailie Trumbull and Mr. Clerk Touthope, to whom I referred him for farther particulars. Whether the property returned to the Northumbrian fox hunter, or continued to bear the person of the Scottish attorney, it is unnecessary for me at present to say. We now pursued our journey to the northwestward, at a rate much slower than that at which we had achieved our nocturnal retreat from England. One chain of barren and uninteresting hills succeeded another, until the more fertile vale of Clyde opened upon us, and, with such dispatch as we might, we gained the town, or, as my guide pertinaciously termed it, the city, of Glasgow. Of late years, I understand, it has fully deserved the name, which, by a sort of political second sight, my guide assigned to it. An extensive and increasing trade with the West Indies and American colonies has, if I am rightly informed, laid the foundation of wealth and prosperity, which, if carefully strengthened and built upon, may one day support an immense fabric of commercial prosperity, but in the earlier time of which I speak, the dawn of this splendor had not arisen. The Union had, indeed, opened to Scotland the trade of the English colonies, but, betwixt want of capital, and the national jealousy of the English, the merchants of Scotland were as yet excluded, in a great measure, from the exercise of the privileges which that memorable treaty conferred on them. Glasgow lay on the wrong side of the island for participating in the East Country or continental trade, by which the trifling commerce as yet possessed by Scotland chiefly supported itself. Yet, though she then gave small promise of the commercial eminence to which, I am informed, she seems now likely one day to attain, Glasgow, as the principal central town of the western district of Scotland, was a place of considerable rank and importance. The broad and brimming Clyde, which flows so near its walls, gave the means of an inland navigation of some importance. Not only the fertile plains in its immediate neighborhood, but the districts of Ayr and Dumfries regarded Glasgow as their capital, to which they transmitted their produce, and received in return such necessaries and luxuries as their consumption required. The dusky mountains of the Western Highlands often sent forth wilder tribes to frequent the marts of St. Mungo's favourite city. Hordes of wild shaggy, dwarfish cattle and ponies, conducted by Highlanders, as wild, as shaggy, and sometimes as dwarfish, as the animals they had in charge, often traversed the streets of Glasgow. Strangers gazed with surprise on the antique and fantastic dress, and listened to the unknown and dissonant sounds of their language, while the mountaineers, armed, even while engaged in this peaceful occupation, with musket and pistol, sword, dagger, and target, stared with astonishment on the articles of luxury of which they knew not the use, and with an avidity which seemed somewhat alarming on the articles which they knew and valued. It is always with unwillingness that the Highlander quits his deserts, and at this early period it was like tearing a pine from its rock, to plant him elsewhere. Yet even then the mountain glens were overpeopled, although thinned occasionally by famine or by the sword, and many of their inhabitants strayed down to Glasgow, there formed settlements, there sought and found employment, although different, indeed, from that of their native hills. This supply of a hardy and useful population was of consequence to the prosperity of the place, furnished the means of carrying on the few manufactures which the town already boasted, and laid the foundation of its future prosperity. The exterior of the city corresponded with these promising circumstances. The principal street was broad and important, decorated with public buildings, of an architecture rather striking than correct in point of taste, and running between rows of tall houses, built of stone, the fronts of which were occasionally richly ornamented with masonwork, a circumstance which gave the street an imposing air of dignity and grandeur, of which most English towns are in some measure deprived, by the slight, insubstantial, and perishable quality and appearance of the bricks with which they are constructed. In the western metropolis of Scotland, my guide and I arrived on a Saturday evening, too late to entertain thoughts of business of any kind. We alighted at the door of a jolly hostler wife, as Andrew called her, the hostelier of old Father Chaucer, by whom we were civilly received. On the following morning the bells pealed from every steeple, announcing the sanctity of the day. Notwithstanding, however, what I had heard of the severity with which the Sabbath is observed in Scotland, my first impulse, not unnaturally, was to seek out Owen, but on inquiry I found that my attempt would be in vain, until kirk time was over. Not only did my landlady and guide jointly assure me that there wadna be a living soul either in the counting-house or dwelling-house of Messrs. McVitie, Macfin, and Company, to which Owen's letter referred me, but, moreover, far less would I find any of the partners there. They were serious men, and wad be where a good Christians ought to be at sic a time, and that was in the Barony Lake Kirk. Asterisk. The Lake Kirk or crypt of the Cathedral of Glasgow served for more than 2 centuries as the church of the Barony parish, and, for a time, was converted into a burial place. In the restorations of this grand building the crypt was cleared out, and is now admired as one of the richest specimens of early English architecture existing in Scotland. Andrew Fairservice, whose disgust at the law of his country had fortunately not extended itself to the other learned professions of his native land, now sung forth the praises of the preacher who was to perform the duty, to which my hostess replied with many loud amens. The result was, that I determined to go to this popular place of worship, as much with the purpose of learning, if possible, whether Owen had arrived in Glasgow, as with any great expectation of edification. My hopes were exalted by the assurance, that if Mr. Ephraim McVitie, worthy man, were in the land of life, he would surely honour the Barony Kirk that day with his presence, and if he chanced to have a stranger within his gates, doubtless he would bring him to the duty along with him. This probability determined my motions, and under the escort of my faithful Andrew, I set forth for the Barony Kirk. On this occasion, however, I had little need of his guidance, for the crowd, which forced its way up a steep and rough-paved street, to hear the most popular preacher in the west of Scotland, would of itself have swept me along with it. On attaining the summit of the hill, we turned to the left, and a large pair of folding doors admitted us, amongst others, into the open and extensive burying place which surrounds the minster or cathedral church of Glasgow. The pile is of a gloomy and massive, rather than of an elegant, style of Gothic architecture, but its peculiar character is so strongly preserved, and so well suited with the accompaniments that surround it, that the impression of the first view was awful and solemn in the extreme. I was indeed so much struck, that I resisted for a few minutes all Andrew's efforts to drag me into the interior of the building, so deeply was I engaged in surveying its outward character. Situated in a populous and considerable town, this ancient and massive pile has the appearance of the most sequestered solitude. High walls divide it from the buildings of the city on one side, on the other it is bounded by a ravine, at the bottom of which, and invisible to the eye, murmurs a wandering rivulet, adding, by its gentle noise, to the imposing solemnity of the scene. On the opposite side of the ravine rises a steep bank, covered with fir trees closely planted, whose dusky shade extends itself over the cemetery with an appropriate and gloomy effect. The churchyard itself had a peculiar character, for though in reality extensive, it is small in proportion to the number of respectable inhabitants who are interred within it, and whose graves are almost all covered with tombstones. There is therefore no room for the long rank grass, which, in most cases, partially clothes the surface of those retreats where the wicked cease from troubling, and the weary are at rest. The broad flat monumental stones are placed so close to each other, that the precincts appear to be flagged with them, and, though roofed only by the heavens, resemble the floor of one of our old English churches, where the pavement is covered with sepulchral inscriptions. The contents of these sad records of mortality, the vain sorrows which they preserve, the stern lesson which they teach of the nothingness of humanity, the extent of ground which they so closely cover, and their uniform and melancholy tenor, reminded me of the roll of the prophet, which was written within and without, and there was written therein lamentations and mourning and woe. The cathedral itself corresponds in impressive majesty with these accompaniments. We feel that its appearance is heavy, yet that the effect produced would be destroyed were it lighter or more ornamental. It is the only metropolitan church in Scotland, excepting, as I am informed, the Cathedral of Kirkwall, in the Orkneys, which remained uninjured at the Reformation, and Andrew Fairservice, who saw with great pride the effect which it produced upon my mind, thus accounted for its preservation. It's a brave kirk, none o' year wigmaleries and curly-whirlies and open-steek hems about it, a solid, well-jointed mason work, that will stand as lang as the world, keep hands and gunpowder at it. It had a mayest to downcome lang sign at the Reformation, when they pewed down the kirks of St. Andrew's in Perth, and Therawa, to cleanse them o' papery, and idolatry, and image worship, and surplices, and sic like rags o' the muckle here that sitteth on 7 hills, as if ane wasna braid enough for her auld hinder end. Say the commons o' Renfrew, and o' the barony, and the Gorbals and that about, they behove to come into Glasgow no fair morning, to try their hand on purging the high kirk o' popish knick-knackets. But the townsmen o' Glasgow, they were feared their auld edifice might slip the girths and gone through sick and rough physic, as they rang the common bell, and assembled the train bands white took o' drum. By good luck, the worthy James Rabot was Dean o' Guild that year, and a good mason he was himself, made him the keener to keep up the auld biggieing, and the trades assembled, and offered downright battle to the commons, rather than their kirk should coo the crans as others had done elsewhere. It wasna for love o' papery, not I could ever say that o' the trades o' Glasgow, say they soon came to an agreement to take the idolatrous statues of saints, sorrow be on them, out o' their nooks, and say the bits o' stane idols were broken in pieces by scripture warrant, and flung into the Mollendiner burn, and the old kirk stood as cross as a cat when the flazer came after, and a body was alike pleased. And I hae heard wise folk say, that if the same had been done in ilka kirk in Scotland, the reform wad just hae been as pure as it is e'en now, and we wad hae mair Christian-like kirks, for I hae been say lang in England, that naething will drive out o' my head, that the dog kennel at Osbaldistone Hall is better than mony a house o' God in Scotland. Thus saying, Andrew led the way into the place of worship.